Okay, hi, we're glad you're with us today. We have two very good topics to discuss, the matter of NRSC measurements and also the EAS issue of what's going to happen before the end of this year and whether you need to budget some real money for it. We're going to talk with Bill Robertson of Digital Alert Systems and discuss the topic. If you haven't done it already, please consider hitting that little subscribe button down in the corner. You can get notification of new posts, but just subscribing will help. We're hoping to hit a goal of 1,000. Maybe that's looking for too many, but if we can get to 1,000, that would be neat, wouldn't it? So we thank you either way. We have some EAS things we want to talk about. And this, I think, is very important. And so I want to get to it here. Perhaps you know or remember that last September, the FCC approved an NPRM, and they said that there would be new rules. Now, we're not talking about the cyber security one that's more recent. This had to do with the EAS that we'll see here. The deadline for implementing them is this December, which is what brings us into the time crunch that I'll talk about in a moment. In the software required, the ability to select iPause CAP audio ahead of the LP when available, perhaps being able to have multilingual alerts more easily used, and the alerts on TV are going to be better set up for the deaf and the blind. Well, that's not everything. What happens is that the equipment manufacturers have to spend a lot of time and money with their staff to program the new requirements, because most of the EAS gear has really been pushing the limits of what can be done with the hardware and software. Sage and Gorman Redlich are working on an updated set of software, and there will be an upgrade charge. It's unknown as yet. DASDEC, the digital alert systems, they'd worked most of these into the existing 4.1 and 4.4 software upgrades, including optional CAP prioritization. But there's one more thing, and the FCC steps in like they tend to do. It's a big one. Now, CAP prioritization is required for all codes. And that may not make sense for tornadoes or weekly tests or whatever, but it's being required. Also, the event code EAN is no longer the emergency action notification, it's the national emergency message. NPT, well, it's so important to make these changes, you know, in Washington, nationwide test of the emergency alert system. And PEP will now be the United States government. Well, what does this mean? The DASDEC owner's choices depends on the model that they have, because this will require for some not only an upgrade, but a complete replacement of the DASDEC boxes. And I'll explain. The reason I'm making this major point is that there's a good number of stations that will need to plan and budget for this right now, because there's no indication the FCC will extend the deadline in December. To find out what model you have of your DASDEC, there is a page here, which you can see on the DASDEC site. And it allows you to go and look into, it's the hardware series identification. And it takes you to a page where you can see what the model that you have. And if it's the one with the Atom processor or the Celeron processor, you're just fine, because as you can see on the right side, they are 64-bit. If you have one of the earlier ones, 10 years or more older, now there's where the problem comes into play. If you've got the 64-bit hardware, you can upgrade. The software assurance program that DASDEC has will indeed help you for just $200 a year. Covers the upgrades from 4.4 to the current 5.1. 5.2 is coming out soon, and 5.3 is scheduled just before the NAB show. So that's $200, or, you know, if you don't want to get the plan, there's another way to go. But if your unit is only 32 bits, you got to replace the whole machine. And that is nasty. The lower cost model is going to get, you're going to be out $2,500. The standard NASDAQ is going to be $3,500. If you're on TV, $5,500. This is because of the FCC doing the way they did it. And because, well, you have to rewrite all that software. And 32-bit, 64-bit, it's a problem. So you may be interested in the version 5 software under the NASDAQ 3, or you may want to upgrade, but you need to look into it, get your planning going. Remember, there's a chip shortage out there. So plan and order early, because you don't know what the delays may be as the end of the year approaches, nor what the FCC will do. I mean, who knows what the FCC will do? So it's going to be fun, right? Bill Robertson from Digital Alert Systems is here with us. And I just want to ask you, Bill, did I cover that pretty well? What did I miss?
One thing that I'd probably go back to one of your earlier slides, the original concept of the trigger cap polling. We did that in our systems, as you indicated, but we did that back in our release of version 4 in 2018. The downside, and so that being the case, we have always been of the opinion that this idea of trigger cap polling, where you could replace or look for a cap version of an alert versus a having to stick with the maybe the first one that you get over EAS, is preferable. But we implemented it with an idea that it's preferable on certain alerts. For example, there's a lot of stuff that we've done to kind of showcase this in the context of an Amber Alert, where you've got a lot more information about what's happening, perhaps information about the name of the child, what the child looks like, a description, the vehicle that they may have last been seen going, the license plate. There's a host of additional pieces of information that can be usually are embedded in the cap message versus the EAS message. Conversely, the idea of forcing a cap alert on an RWT makes no sense. And this is where, again, we think that our implementation was very clean, very well put together, but the FCC has now come in there and said, number one, it's not selectable. It's on everything. So with our implementation, we allowed you to select. You could select it by a global, you could select individual event codes and everything. So for example, a TOR, a tornado warning, you don't have to use the trigger cap polling. Get the message out as soon as possible. Maybe don't use it on an RWT, but use it on an Amber Alert, those kinds of things. Unfortunately, the FCC in a broad stroke just said, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, let's just make everything go that way. So unfortunately, it's actually requiring us to hobble our implementation and force us to make all of the systems now on every event code, listen for a cap message and respond to it accordingly. They've also we had actually set a minimum value of 5 seconds. They now said, no, the minimum must be 10 seconds. So again, it's a little bit of a trying thing that they've implemented this particular thing to try to push it in such a way. Again, very much to the spirit I enjoy, but they've actually created some headaches more for us because we have to cripple our implementation to meet the letter of the law. So that's a little bit disconcerting to us, is the fact that we really think there's a better way to do it, but unfortunately, we're kind of crippled that way. The other part, Barry, that you talked about is really the context of where we have to go. And as a technology company, again, we came out with trigger cap polling. We've done a bunch of stuff. We came out with Alert Agent back in version 3. We've done a lot of real, I think, innovative things to be able to move things forward. But also in that same context, we have to advance as the software and the development tools advance and give us capabilities that we may not have or not possible. For example, 10-year-old hardware that is based on a 32-bit processor is just not current. We and our development tools and things like that have to move to 64-bit. The security things that we do a lot of those elements are really not incorporated in old software versions. You do not see people running, Windows 7, for example, in these particular things. So there's a lot of stuff around this that we just have to kind of go and march forward in that. I want to also kind of mention something that, it sounded like, all of a sudden, and I would also say kind of on the FCC side, I would have really enjoyed it if the FCC would have granted a wider window, primarily for budget purposes and a lot of customers to be able to do that, because dropping this thing essentially at the end of 2022 doesn't give customers enough time in many respects to budget. Their budgets are on the bigger companies are set, August, September timeframe, and this thing drops and say, oh, I got to have it within the next fiscal year. Doesn't give people a lot of flexibility, and it would have been better to be able to do that. But people would say, oh, geez, if I've got a 10-year-old box, I need to update it. Well, there's some considerations around that. The other thing too is, as some of these change, and we can go back to 10 years ago, or actually 11 years ago in 2012, when the initial cap mandate came out. There were many systems out there that they may have had old EAS encoder decoders that weren't cap ready. And you had to buy a new device at that particular point because you were kind of forced into this new requirement. So yeah, I know there's some hem and haw and other things around it, but I think you've captured the essence of it. We have to move forward. We've got to do some of the things that are necessary. The FCC, I think, again, the spirit is the correct thing. I wish we would have been able to offer a little bit more insight to it, to trim it a little bit. And I think the timing is a little bit off to do that. But for the most part, the bulk of DASDEC owners have newer boxes that are 64-bit. So it's a pretty simple upgrade to do that. And I think, thank you very much for mentioning the software assurance plan was what we put together so that people could budget this very simply, very easily on an annual basis. And whatever software comes out, whatever we do, you're current. And that's the key thing. But the FCC, and even when you talked about the cybersecurity thing, the emphasis that the FCC is talking and looking at is people. You have to keep these things updated. You have to keep them current. And that's really kind of the fundamental thing. So thanks for.
Bill, that's good and appreciate it. And the reason I brought this forward, folks, is because, again, it's January and we're 12 months, 11 months away. But budgets, as Bill said, you just don't want to end up, and then chip shortage, you don't want to end up in November and Bill sends you a note that says, well, we can't do it till March or something like that. Bill, I got a note here in the chat box from Chuck Conrad. Yesterday, a lady from DASDEC quoted me a lot more for the upgrade, $500. She said it'd be the last upgrade for my DASDEC too, and I'd have to buy a new box.
I don't have the full context, but it might be the fact that you could get upgraded to, the current version 4.4 is the last in our 32-bit series. And so you can get the version 4.4 for 32-bit, but to get beyond that, if your hardware is not 64-bit compatible, we can't get you all the way, into the next stuff because that requires 64-bit. That might be the case.
Harold, yes, they went through an NPRM and then they adopted it, and that was in September.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Bill, this is Brady.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to easily determine if our boxes are 64-bit compatible?
Yeah, actually, Barry brought that up. The simplest thing, you can actually go to our website. At the top, there is a link at the very top says resources.
Right, I'll show this again.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, I was late. I might have missed that. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, instead of having to type that whole long string in there, you can find it by going to our website at digitalertsystems.com. Go to resources at the top. Right below that is application notes, and about the 5th or 6th application note down is the one that says hardware identification. Barry, if you click that and go to the actual page, you can kind of see what that looks like. I think if you could highlight that.
Is that showing?
It hasn't popped up here.
Okay. Or it took me to a different screen.
Yeah.
Let's see. It's the problem with sharing screens. Okay.
So Brady, you can go right there to that application note, and that will tell you how to identify your hardware. And for the most part, again, we've had in the DASDEC 2 model series, we've had 4 different main processor units. As you can see, the architecture in the /1 and /2 are really probably between 11 and 12 years old series. I mean, we've had DASDEC 2 out since we introduced it in 2010. So, we're now in 2023, so it's 13 years in that particular model series. So those /1, /2 units are probably at least in that time frame. If you go into the /3s, which were the bulk of them, and /4 models, you're probably talking 2016 and beyond. So again, depending on the age of the unit, but it's best to look at the processor just to verify.
If you have the Atom or the Celeron, you're okay.
Mhm.
And you can go on to version 5. If this model name comes up and you've got the Eden processor, you are going to have to buy a new box.
And I'm sorry, I also might have missed when you stopped supporting the 32-bit. Do you stop supporting the 32-bit machines?
We're still supporting the 32-bit machines in some context. I mean, in other words, you can call our support team, you can do things. We're still making version 4.4 available, and it will continue to be a working software release right up until, quite frankly, the FCC rules come into play in December, when it says you must have these new set of requirements.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, then 4.4 does not have the current requirements, is that correct, or the new ones?
It has trigger cap polling, however, it doesn't have the new changes, as Barry pointed out, the statement changes to the EAN, the statement changes to the PEP. There's a little bit more in that, by the way, Barry. There's a kind of an if-then scenario. Yeah. So if it comes over cap, you use one set of text. If it comes over EAS, you use a different set of text. So those all are embedded in a newer version, because we're not going backwards and developing on 32-bit stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the question is, would 4.4 still be legal after December 31st?
No, it won't.
Okay. Yep. Then it's not worth buying the upgrade. I can see that. So
yeah, and that's the thing too, is that, and we actually encourage people that if you have hardware that won't support a version 5, it's best not to go down that path, only if you have to do a system upgrade. That's a much better chance. I don't want to see you spend money on something that can't take you forward.
Okay. Anybody else have a question for Bill before we let him go here?
Well, I've got another one. Is there any plan on the System 3 version to have a more stripped down version that doesn't have all the video stuff? Because for small radio stations, I frankly don't need a bunch of HDMI outputs and stuff. I don't know what I'd do with them.
Yeah, in fact, we have it. It's called, if you look at it on our site, we have what's called the DAS3 EL, and that's the entry level. No video, no AES audio. It's got the minimum requirements. It's got the 2 input sources. You can get it with the 2 integrated radios if you want to, and it's much less money. Analog switching, and you don't have any of that stuff.
Okay, DAS3 AL, you said.
No,
okay.
DAS3-EL. Edward Lima.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Okay,
I'll check into that, because the lady sent me to this one that looked really cool. I mean, if I was an ATSC3 TV station and had 5 different TV channels I was broadcasting, it'd be really cool. It'll do all kinds of stuff. But I'm just sitting here, a little radio station, and we're audio only, and probably going to stay that way.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
And so we do. We've got different variations, again, for the entry level model as analog only, and in fact, that can be upgraded if you want to, but that's really kind of what is the thing. We don't have just a one fits only. We can modify it and make a system that really fits what your requirements are.
Well, this is getting into some money that's pretty significant for small broadcasters. That's I'm not real happy about the FCC. You probably aren't either. Just because they keep moving the goalpost. And
what would you rather we let you know in June?
No, I'd rather know now, obviously. Yeah. But I've actually been on this discovery path the last 2 or 3 days. It's one of the things that I've been doing, and so far I haven't really found an answer I'm really liking. Well, if you know what I mean.
Forgive the cynicism, but the only option other than December is if the phones of various Congress critters ring many, many times and they push pressure on the FCC. Otherwise, it's December.
Yeah. And Chuck, if you want to, you can call me after or something like that. Just contact me and I could take you through some more of the details on other options you might have. Because quite frankly, our lowest cost option is $2,100 just out of the chute. So it's not over the top. I'm not saying it's cheap, but it's a lot less than you might see. Again, if you're getting one that's fully loaded, it's going to be a lot more money because there's a lot more options in it.
Yeah, that's not a crazy price. $3,500, $4,000, at least for me, is a crazy price. So that's
Right.
just the way it is.
Okay.
Thanks. You'll hear from me.
All right. 5.1 is out, Brady. 5.2 is coming up shortly.
No. Let me qualify that. So version 5 is currently shipping with our DASDEC 3 models. We are working on the upgrade server that people that have 64-bit capable hardware will be able to get the version 5 probably by the end of this month. We hope that we've been testing the upgrade server and everything else like that, so we'll be able to do that. Soon thereafter, 5.1 will be available, and then 5.2 hot on its heels because we're doing a lot of other security fixes and really unique things that we're doing inside of the 5.2 series. And then as you pointed out, Barry, and thank you very much, 5.3, which is going to encompass all of these latest FCC changes where we have to go back and kind of hobble our trigger cap pulling, but do the other changes in the text stuff, is targeted for just before NAB.
Okay.
Okay, Bill, this is Brady again. Another question.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay.
The 5.0, is that an added cost?
Well, it depends on where you are. If you are currently, of DASDEC 3, you've got 5.0. If you're a member of the software assurance plan, then there's no additional cost because you'll get it as soon as it's available on the upgrade server. If you are on version 4 and you're not a member of the software assurance plan, then there is an upgrade cost. And so, again, depending on where you are in the strata, it kind of dictates how much it costs you.
Do you know what that upgrade cost is, assuming I'm not in the software assurance?
If you're not in the software assurance plan, you're going from 4 to 5. It's set up for $495.
Okay, thank you. I just need to let the powers that be know. So thanks.
Gotcha.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate you being with us. And
Yep, no problem. I'll
Let's
stand
do
by and track alongside. Thanks.
okay. Well, we're going to move on then for the moment to the NRSC, which we had highlighted. There's some issues here that are worth discussing. Just to review very briefly, it started about 1987. I remember Greg Oganowski and Bob Orban talking about this at the end of a meeting in St. Louis, and there was a formation of the committee. Eventually, some things were laid out. It was decided, and the FCC accepted it, to limit the bandwidth to 11 kilohertz, and when the curve goes down. And AM stations are required to make a measurement of their emissions against a mask every year within 14 months. FM stations are also doing a bandwidth picture, but it's just once when you put a new transmitter in, new antenna, new system, something like that. So that's all pretty straightforward. We have Eric Scace with us today. He's up in the Denver area, and I have some pictures here from Norm Laramie out in Tulsa. There's an article by James Boyd on the BDR website. And most importantly for you, here's something that you should look at. It's on the website on NRSC measurements, or if you go to the menu, you can see this under services, NRSC. And this will bring you to a list of folks around the country that can take care of your NRSC measurement, and you can schedule an appointment. Some of them schedule a whole bunch of appointments in a row to cut down on travel expenses that you wouldn't have to pay. And some are in different parts of the year. So you're welcome to check that out. What you get is a report. And on that report, you're looking at this particular, I've hidden the name of the station, doesn't matter. You can see they're within the mask. And even as you go further out, there's the mask, and this is outside the mask, so it's not a problem. Actually, I take that back. That was determined to be from an adjacent station, not the station being measured. Another thing that some of the NRSC folks do, and I think Eric just told me that he does it as well, he does a 10-minute modulation watch picture. So you can see how many times you hit 125% or how close you are to 100%, things like that. And that's good information to have. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to Eric to talk for a little bit. Eric is as I said, based out of Denver. He does this work, and he has some good things to say about why you should concern yourself with NRSC.
Well, hello, everyone. And Barry asked me, I think yesterday morning, if I would join in to answer questions on the topic, and please ask questions as we go along. I did want to share a few things, and it was fortuitous that Barry called me because I've been looking into how I do NRSC measurements and how they might be improved. It's been pretty common. And Barry, if you let me share my screen, I can show some images here.
Yep, you got it.
Okay. So let's see. Yeah. So this is a pretty common handheld spectrum analyzer tool to take out into the field. It's expensive. And it's also slow because it's battery powered, and fast processors are huge energy sucks. But this is an example of an instrument that I've been using for a number of years to do spectrum analysis work, and not just in the AM band, but in other bands as well. More recently, there have been other interesting instruments that have come out into the marketplace, and I started looking around to see if there were ways of making these measurements that could be done with instruments that could serve multiple purposes. One example of instruments that are smaller, require less power, and are easier to carry around are so-called headless instruments that don't have displays but use your laptop, which you're going to have anyhow for data collection purposes, to do the display and much of the number crunching. This happens to be a Keysight instrument. It's extremely expensive and out of my budget for this purpose. But more interesting is perhaps this one, which is a combination spectrum analyzer, vector network analyzer, and TDR. It's made in China. It's in the same kind of performance level that the NRSC instrument that I showed you earlier is. And because it has all these other functions, it's quite useful around the station in general. So this particular unit goes up to 6.5 gigs, which is good for tuning your satellite downlink. And it's about $9,000, as I recall, which is considerably less than the NRSC new or the Keysight instruments that I showed. The one issue for doing field measurements with an instrument like this is it runs off of 120 volt AC conventional power, which of course you would have in the lab, but you might not have sitting out in the field at a measurement location. What I've started using are these field AC power battery packs. This one is made by EcoFlow. It's called a Delta 2. It has more than enough amp hours in it to run a heap of analyst tools for a day. And this one can also be recharged from your 12-volt outlet in your car or topped off in your car if you should be running shy at the end of the day. The nice thing about this particular unit is that I took it out into a quiet rural location and tested it to see if there was any increase in noise floor in that location when this unit was in operation at various load levels, and it is quiet from an RF standpoint. So as a DC to AC inverter pack, it was a very good one, and it allows one to take lightweight but desktop test instruments into the field and use them and have the benefit of their faster speed and performance characteristics. So that was one thing that I had started taking a look into, and I've been playing around that with this during this measurement season and been pretty happy with that. There are a number of documents around that talk about how to do NRSC measurements, but I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about some interesting gotchas, particularly when you're working in an urban environment, as I do here in the Denver area. So just starting from the top, probably choosing a location at which to make one's measurement is the biggest challenge in an urban environment. So if we go to a different screen here, yeah. This is an example of a station location that I was asked to look at, and down in the lower center is where the transmitting antenna is. It's a non-directional station. And there's drawn on Google Maps a faint red line here, which you see crossing this field, which is 1 kilometer away from the station. So the FCC says if you're working with a directional array, you should be about 10 wavelengths away, which can be pretty challenging to have enough signal to noise ratio to work with for these measurements. And particularly if you're in an area with high urban noise level, as you can see from all the suburban development around this particular transmitting site. The other thing about picking a location is you want to pick one where near-in stations that are on adjacent channels can be nulled out by your measurement antenna. And that kind of restricts the directions that you can go into in order to make these measurements. So fortunately for this particular station, I was able to choose a location almost due north of the station at the edge of this large field. It was relatively quiet. It did not have an overhead power line going by to distort the patterns or pick up for the antenna. And there was sufficient signal strength to make a measurement run for this station. But those are the trade-offs. You want to be close, but not too close. Particularly if you're working with directional arrays, and you want to be, sometimes you need to move around to different locations in order to demonstrate that a signal that appears to be violating the mask is actually coming from a different station, and doing that by showing that you can null that signal out without changing the primary signal using your loop antenna. The other things that are useful to carry along with you is a step attenuator. A lot of spectrum analyzers do include attenuators, but they tend to be pretty gross, 10 dB or 20 dB steps. 1 dB step attenuator will let you fine tune where you position the signal within the strength measurement range or dynamic range of the receiver of the spectrum analyzer. And that becomes important because particularly when you're looking at harmonics or other distortion products, you want to make sure that the distortion product is coming from the transmitter and not being generated by the receiver inside the spectrum analyzer. And then 2 kinds of notch filters are useful to have. One is a tunable notch filter that is quite narrow that you can use to notch out the carrier itself, and that will allow you to look a little bit closer down to the minus 80 dB level for spurs. And I carry around a broadcast band reject filter that has a very sharp knee at about 1.8 megahertz, and that's quite useful when you're looking at harmonics. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention, because it's sometimes overlooked, loop antennas have different response characteristics at different frequencies. I once was asked to take a look at a station whose second harmonic had been measured as violating the mask requirements, but it turned out that the measurement had been made without accounting for the behavior of the sampling antenna that was being used. Once a proper sampling antenna with a calibrated response curve had been programmed in to the system, we could see that the antenna was much more responsive at the second and third harmonics, according to the calibration table. And once you took that into account, in fact, those harmonics were below the mask levels, and so the station was in compliance. Similarly, in another situation, was an example of another consideration, and I can show you that one here. So let's see. Pick a different screen. Give me a moment. Yeah, this one here. So in this case, if I have the right image here, this was a station that was transmitting 5 kilohertz of analog and then running HD sidebands on it. And one of the HD sidebands appeared to be above the mask, the upper sideband, but it was only a tiny bit above the mask. And one has to recognize that both the antenna calibration tables, your step attenuator, and your instrument all have errors associated with them, and those errors are specified by the manufacturer. So although the actual plot showed that this station was slightly in violation on one of its sidebands, that slight violation was well within the measurement error of the overall system. And so that was noted on the report. So those were some things that Barry and I were talking about that we thought might be of interest and might provoke a conversation, and happy to take questions. So now I see a whole bunch of chat messages. That's awesome.
Well, while you're reading that, I'll mention that Norm also made the point about the 1 kilometer circle, that many times you can't find a good location a kilometer away, either because, as you say, of adjacent channels, construction, or the other thing is station power versus the ambient RFI. And so this becomes an issue for the person doing the measurement to find the right spot. And this is one of the reasons you may want to hire somebody like Eric to come do it for you, rather than get involved in all the aspects here of trying to find the right spot. Does anyone have any questions for Eric?
I
Harold,
posted a couple there.
yeah. Hi, Harold. So you asked a question, should error be assumed to be in the favor of the station, or are we obliged to like push down to be not just below the mask, but below with the measurement error around the mask? I've gone through a number of station inspections, and the inspectors, when confronted with a situation like that, have all accepted spectrum reports that show 10-minute marks above the mask, but within the measurement error of the system. And as long as you provide the measurement error data from the instruments and calibration tables that you have, that seems to be accepted.
Is it to our advantage to use less accurate equipment then?
Maybe in that respect, but in a different respect, the less accurate equipment usually has poor performance characteristics, which makes measuring an 80 dB range between the carrier and the bottom of the mask a lot more challenging. So, so no. And the other thing to be aware of is when you're combining uncertainties that come from different stages of your measurement process. So let's say your loop antenna calibration table says for this particular model of loop antenna, each of the dB response values has an error of plus or minus a half a dB. And your instrument error is plus or minus 1.5 dB. And maybe you're using a step attenuator and it's 1/10 of a dB plus or minus in the step attenuator, or maybe less. There's some rules about how you combine those to come up with an overall system measurement error, and they're described under something called GUM, a general uncertainty model. And it's a fairly simple math process to add them together, but you can't just add, in this example, 1/10 of a dB of attenuator error plus 1.5 dB of spectrum analyzer error plus whatever I said, half a dB for antenna calibration tape error, and come up and say, well, I have a 2.1 dB uncertainty in my measurement. That's not the way they combine. They combine more statistically to give you a range that says you're 90% confident that the number is within this range. That's what the general uncertainty model is supposed to do.
So the other thing I posted there had to do with directional stations. And as I read that, if you have, say, 3 dB gain in the major lobe, then your reference level is down 3 because it's based on the non-directional field or the RMS field for the full antenna. So all your limits are, say, down 3 below what you're seeing for a carrier level.
Yes, although in practice, I've never found that to be an issue. I don't know if your experience is different.
I was just wondering what you use as a limit. Do you reference the RMS or non-directional field?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good.
Eric, Brian.
I'm not sure a lot of people know that rule exists.
Brian Black asks us, what are the spectrum analyzer specs necessary to do this measurement? And this is something that is important because there are a lot of these analyzers that are just not fast enough or with the right bandwidth. I know that when Bellar came out with a monitor that was to do spectrum analysis, it wasn't good enough for an NRSC measurement.
Yes, and there are a lot of spectrum analyzers that are not good enough, unfortunately. And this is the problem in using these combination instruments. So vector network analyzers have a receiver in them, and you can use that receiver for spectrum analysis in many cases. But oftentimes those receivers are not designed for doing for giving you the best performance as a spectrum analyzer. They won't have the dynamic range that a dedicated spectrum analyzer tool would possess. As a result, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty measuring a signal that's, let's say, 90 dB above the instrument noise floor in order to apply an 80 dB range of mask values to the signal. And similarly, the noise floor of the instrument, when you hook an antenna up to it, if it's confronted with enough strong signals, will be lifted, and that raised noise floor will eat into the margin that you have for making these measurements. So unfortunately, inexpensive spectrum analyzers often are problematic for doing these kinds of NRSC checks.
Eric, I'll ask you also in terms of FM. Do you do FM spectrum plots?
Yes, yes, I do. Some of the analyzers will, or are quite helpful in that they include FM demodulators so that you can see spectrum behavior within the demodulated FM signal as well. And we'll give you a chance to look at pilot levels and frequencies and so forth. So I also take a GPS frequency reference out in the field with me if one isn't built within the spectrum analyzer itself, so that I get so that I can take a frequency measurement of the carriers and know that that's reasonably accurate. And as you mentioned earlier, taking a modulation monitor out with me provides another useful understanding of the station's performance. The Innovonics equipment that's available now, I think it occupies about 15 watts of power. It's also AC powered, but with one of these AC sources, you can use that and get some very good statistics on both AM and FM station behavior under modulation.
I remember we had Bert Weiner on a year or two ago and discussing NRSC at that time. And he mentioned some of the issues and situations with the monitoring apparatus available and what had to be done. And we also discussed some of the common problems. The most common, at least it seemed with the Gates 1 through 5 series, was the big capacitors going bad, resulting in harmonic spurs. What would you say, Eric, is the most common thing that you find that puts them outside the range?
I don't have any common problem. I have a range of uncommon problems. So let's see. I did pull one up here. And let me see if I can get it up on the screen real quickly. This was yeah, I think it's this one here. And my screen share doesn't
There it
tell me
goes.
which one I'm looking at.
We got a blue screen.
You have a blue screen with nothing on it?
That's correct.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. In fact, let me do it this way.
It's a very nice blue.
Oh, yeah. So I see. All right. Let's stop that. Let's try a different one. Here we go. Do desktop number 2. Okay.
Almost matched Bill's shirt.
So this was an AM station, and if you look here just to the right of center, you'll see this irregular shape above the knee in the mask. And that's what's called spectral regrowth for HD signals. And on the upper sideband HD, there was this spur above the mask. It didn't exist on the lower sideband. And just peculiar to that transmitter, and they were able to address it with the manufacturer. So sometimes you find things like this. The other thing that gets to be a challenge is stations that are diplexing or triplexing, because there you want to look at the various potential products between the signals that are in the stations that are being provided by each of the transmitters. And that's a lot more stuff to look at during the course of your measurement period, because all of these each one of these takes sitting there for 10 minutes. So if you're looking for the second harmonic peak value, that's you've measured your spectrum around the carrier for 10 minutes, then you go and you set up to measure the second harmonic. That's another 10 minutes. Then the third harmonic, that's another 10 minutes. Hopefully you're happy with those. Then you might be looking at mixing products, and first thing you know, you're there all afternoon. So it helps to be organized and have a checklist, but also to be patient.
Very good. I think when we look at these things and the temptation is, hey, I'll do it myself and get all that stuff. But having somebody that's been through this a few times, like yourself, as you say, getting that checklist, going down the list, making sure you touch all the bases, that saves a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of agony.
I have a quick comment on that.
Hi, Grady.
Hi, Barry. That was a very good comment from Eric about multi-station, multiplexed sites. I'm the manager of several such sites for the landowner and the building owner and the other radio station or radio stations that are involved in some of these diplexed and triplex sites. It's almost impossible to get them to realize that the best way to do it is for everybody to get organized and do one set of measurements, because each of the stations has particular frequencies and bands and intermod products that they have to be concerned with because they would be the source of that particular energy. But because you have to go and make the measurements on both day pattern and night pattern, that means all the facilities on the site have to change to the night pattern and night power when any one station is making those measurements. So if you can't get everybody to cooperate, it gets more expensive for each of the licensees, and it gets a lot less efficient because you've got a lot of daytime coverage drops while you have to do this. So that's the end of my comment.
Sounds like really with the growth of diplexing and triplexing, this is something that stations need to take into account, whether they want to do it themselves or hire someone.
Question. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a quick answer for that. My position is that I don't make any of these measurements for any station that I do contract or part-time employed engineering work for. I like the arm's length relationship with the person who's measuring it, because then no one can say that I fudged things in my favor.
There's a question asked, once the measurement is documented, what do we do with the document? So you should get a report that describes how the measurements were made, what instruments were used and antennas were used. There should be images that show, if we take, for example, a more simpler situation, which is a single transmitter into an antenna system, it shows the performance around the main frequency, and then has an image that shows principal harmonics to prove that they're within tolerance. But you will get a report with each of the measurement results in it, documented in a graphical form. And then that should go into your station transmitter log file, and that's to be kept for 2 years.
Stan has a question here about the eighth harmonic.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of, I've seen email discussions about dealing with cellular companies and harmonics. I think Grady's point is helpful, getting independent engineers in there to do the tests. It's important for everyone to understand how the measurements were made and where they were made, to show that the broadcast station is not out of compliance in this respect, and that the responsibility for resolving a problem that exists at a cellular site is not the responsibility of the broadcast station, assuming that that's what the engineer's report shows. But yeah, there's some gotchas, and it needs to be done carefully and documented well.
The whole LTE issue is really kind of a difficult one, because too many of these cellular companies send guys out that want to see a noise floor of minus 124 or something like that. And that just isn't, that's not within the range of most machines, nor really in most transmitters.
I had a comment on the record maintenance, looking at 73.1225. They say that the following records must be or shall be made available by all broadcast stations upon request from the FCC. And it says equipment performance measurements, which is what we're talking about here. But since FM ones are only required on an equipment change, it could certainly be longer than 2 years. Similarly, antenna resistance or common point measurements. So I think you have to at least keep the last one available.
Yep, that's right. Thanks, Harold, for that correction.
Here's a question that came in on LPFM. Do they do NRSC bandwidth?
I think I'm speaking off the top of my head, but I think they have the same obligation to do that when their transmitter and antenna system are installed or changed. The same FM requirements, but you'd have to look into the LPFM section to be sure.
Comment.
Yep.
John?
So if you look at the LPFM rules, they're required to purchase an LPFM type accepted transmitter that has the audio processor built in, and that's why a lot of your LPFM equipment has the Orban inside an Orban 5500. And then when you purchase it from the factory like that, it'll come. Essentially, they do the occupied bandwidth or NRSC measurement there at the factory into a 50 ohm load. And so that's why technically LPFMs are not, they're really not allowed to use, say, an Orban 8500 or 8600 or something like that, because they have to use the audio processor that was built into the train.
I don't think that's correct.
If
A long time since I dealt with LPFM, but I don't believe that the transmitters that came out when LPFM first was approved and the ones that had FCC type acceptance did not have a processor built into them. So maybe that's something new. I don't know.
Well, I started to become familiar with the LPFM rules about 10 years ago, and I didn't pay any attention to the rules before then, I have to admit. So I can't speak much earlier than that, but today, if it's they're required to purchase an LPFM type accepted transmitter, and that would have the audio processor built in. Now
They don't all have the processor built in. I know that RVRs and PTEX and a bunch of others that do have LPFM approval numbers do not have it. And I don't think even some of the Crowns is an option. So I think that's incorrect, but I'll stand corrected if they've changed the rules. It's been since about 2007 since I had any involvement with LPFM, and I must admit I'm happy about that. But whole other story. I do have a question though about the NRSC for your AM. Somebody suggested that ought to all be posted on your public file. Is that correct? Because I've never heard that before until somebody just hit me with that, and I went, really? I've got it all. It's readily available to any FCC inspector who wants to come by and take a look at it. That's not a problem, and I suppose I could scan it all and put it on our public file, but where? Just curious.
You're not required to post it in your public file. You're only required to keep it in your records, but some people put it in their public file just because.
Okay, well, that's what I thought. I thought you weren't required to have it. I have a nice file drawer. It's almost right behind me on my right-hand side, if you look at it, and it's all in there. So I'm not real worried about anybody who wants to see it, and I'll scan it and send it to them if they want. But the putting it on the public file was a new one to me. So just curious. Thank you for the clarification.
I'm surprised there are not more questions about some of these things. It's pretty cut and dry. I mean, you do it once a year on AM within 14 months. On FM, you do it when you install new equipment. That's
I have
all.
a question.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, my question is, what do the rules say about the commissioning of a Part 74 FM translator? I did it on ours, but I had trouble finding somebody or convincing somebody to do the measurements, saying you don't need to do that.
We do those at EMF Broadcasting. Yeah, we do our translators as well as the full powers.
For the stations I work at, we do it too, but that may be out of an abundance of caution. We just want to make sure that it's working properly.
I also do it for all my new installations, just as a matter of being a good neighbor, whether it's required or not.
Well, that sounds good, and thank you. And with or without that requirement, I'm glad we had it done on ours after we inaugurated our service. But I was just wondering about the specific requirement.
A lot of what we do really is being a good neighbor.